When charming financial advisor Kevin promised to protect my late wife's nest egg, I decided to show him what a 73-year-old engineer really keeps in his basement safe. The coffee maker gurgled to life at exactly 5:47 a.m. Same as it had every morning for the past 14 months since Dorothy passed. I measured 2 scoops of Folgers into the filter, enough for the pot Dorothy and I used to share, though now I would pour most of it down the drain by evening. Old habits die harder than spouses, I had learned. The kitchen still held traces of her presence, the ceramic rooster she had insisted on keeping by the window, the recipe cards filed in her precise handwriting, the second coffee mug sitting in the dish drainer, because I couldn't bring myself to put it away permanently. I stood at the kitchen window watching the Hendersons' house across the street. Jim was already in his driveway, probably heading to his part-time job at the hardware store. Lucky bastard had somewhere to go, something useful to do with his hands. At 73, I had been forcibly retired from Morrison Engineering for 8 years, but my body still expected the rhythm of work, the satisfaction of solving problems that mattered. Instead, I solved crossword puzzles and wondered why the newspaper seemed to shrink every year. The morning ritual continued with mechanical precision. Shower, shave, dress in clothes Dorothy had picked out the Christmas before she got sick. She had always said I had no sense of color coordination, and she had been right about that, like she had been right about most things. I had wear these shirts until they fell apart, partly from thrift, and partly because changing felt like admitting she was really gone. By 7:30, I was sitting at the kitchen table with my coffee, newspaper, and the pill organizer Dorothy had bought me years ago. 7 different medications now, for blood pressure, cholesterol, prostate, and other indignities of aging that she had never have to experience. The newspaper had become depressing politics. Crime, young people complaining about problems that seemed trivial compared to burying your wife of 47 years. I usually made it through the sports section before the futility of reading about games I had never attended overwhelmed me. The phone rarely rang anymore. Our friends had scattered to retirement communities, nursing homes, or cemeteries. Dorothy's sister called monthly from Phoenix, dutiful but distant. My son Michael called every other Sunday from Seattle. Our conversations stilted and careful, both of us avoiding topics that might require emotional honesty. He had his own life, his own problems, his own family that didn't include room for a grieving father who had never learned how to express feelings without Dorothy translating for him. The tool shed in the backyard had become my refuge, though I rarely fixed anything anymore. Instead, I had sit among the carefully organized wrenches, screwdrivers, and power tools, remembering when my hands built things that lasted. 43 years at Morrison Engineering, designing bridges that would outlive me by decades. Now my greatest accomplishment was remembering to take my pills and keeping the grass trimmed to neighborhood standards. Dorothy's medical bills had eaten through most of our savings those final 2 years. Cancer treatment, experimental drugs, private nurses, everything insurance wouldn't cover. I would have spent 10 times more if it would have bought her another year, another month, another conversation where she smiled and called me her stubborn old fool. The house was paid off. My pension covered basic expenses, but the financial cushion we had built over 4 decades had evaporated into medical costs and funeral expenses that seemed designed to impoverish the grieving. The afternoons stretched endlessly. I would drive to the grocery store, buying food for 1 person while remembering meals Dorothy had planned for 2. The checkout clerks were polite but rushed, treating elderly customers like obstacles to efficiency rather than human beings deserving respect. I would come home to a house that echoed with 47 years of shared memories, eat dinner while watching television programs that assumed viewers had someone to discuss them with, then sit in my recliner until bedtime arrived like a merciful reprieve. Sleep brought its own challenges. The bed felt enormous without Dorothy's familiar weight beside me. I had wake at 3 a.m., reach for her hand, and find empty space that reminded me every night that I was fundamentally alone. The house made settling noises I had never noticed when we had shared them, creaks and sighs that sounded like loneliness given voice. Some mornings I would find Dorothy's pillow clutched against my chest, a pathetic gesture I would never admit to anyone. The social isolation wasn't intentional, but it was complete. Dorothy had maintained our friendships, organized our social calendar, remembered birthdays and anniversaries and obligations that kept us connected to the wider world. Without her coordination, I had drifted away from people who had been important to us. Too proud to admit I needed help maintaining relationships she had managed effortlessly. The result was a life measured in daily routines performed for an audience of one. An existence that felt more like extended dying than actual living. Weekends were the worst. Saturday mornings. Dorothy and I used to plan projects, garden work, home repairs, visits with friends or family. Now Saturdays yawned ahead like prison sentences, empty hours to be endured rather than enjoyed. I would find myself standing in the garage, holding tools I no longer needed, remembering when Dorothy would bring me lemonade and supervise my work with affectionate criticism. Those tools represented competence, usefulness, the ability to solve problems and fix things that were broken. Now they were relics from a time when I had mattered to someone other than myself. The neighborhood had changed around me. Young families moved in, full of energy and purpose, and children who made noise Dorothy would have loved. They were polite but distant, treating me like a harmless relic from an earlier era rather than someone who had lived in this house since before they were born. Their lives seemed impossibly busy, impossibly important, impossibly different from the quiet desperation of elderly widowhood. I had watched them from my kitchen window, envying their sense of purpose and wondering what it felt like to be essential to someone's happiness. Church had become uncomfortable after Dorothy's death. People offered condolences and casseroles, but their sympathy felt hollow, performed rather than genuine. The sermons about eternal life and heavenly reunions struck me as platitudes designed to comfort people who weren't actually grieving. I had sit in the pew we had shared for 23 years, surrounded by couples who still had partners to whisper with during boring sermons, feeling more alone in that crowded sanctuary than in my empty house. The checking account balance had become a source of constant anxiety. Dorothy's death benefits had covered funeral costs, but my pension barely stretched to cover mortgage-free living. The property taxes kept rising, the utilities seemed to increase monthly, and medical expenses that Medicare didn't cover created a steady drain on resources I couldn't replace. I had started shopping with coupons, comparing prices, making decisions based on necessity rather than preference. The financial insecurity was another reminder that I was one emergency away from losing the independence Dorothy, and I had fought so hard to maintain. Every morning, I had sit at the kitchen table with my coffee and wonder what Dorothy would think about the man I would become. She had married someone who built bridges, who solved problems, who took care of his family and planned for the future. Now I was a 73-year-old man eating cereal for dinner, because cooking for one person required more energy than I could summon. She would be disappointed, I thought, not angry, but disappointed in how completely I had surrendered to circumstances, instead of fighting back the way she would taught me to fight. The loneliness had weight and texture, like a physical presence that followed me through each day. It sat beside me during meals, rode in the passenger seat during errands, lay down next to me every night where Dorothy used to sleep. Some days it felt like drowning in slow motion, each breath requiring conscious effort, each activity performed through a fog of purposelessness that made everything seem pointless. I would catch myself talking to Dorothy out loud, having conversations with empty rooms, practicing speeches I had never give to audiences that no longer existed. The doorbell rang at exactly 2:15 on a Tuesday afternoon, interrupting a nap I hadn't intended to take. Through the peephole I saw a young man in an expensive suit holding a leather briefcase, looking like he had stepped out of a financial services advertisement. He had the kind of smile dentists use in commercials, perfectly engineered to inspire trust and suggest competence. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity overcame caution. Besides, Dorothy had always said I was too suspicious of people who were just trying to help. Mr. Robert Chen, I am Kevin Morrison from Pinnacle Financial Services. I believe we have a mutual friend who suggested I stop by. His handshake was firm but not aggressive, his voice carrying just enough concern to suggest this wasn't a sales call. He was probably 40, the age my son would be if Michael had stayed in touch more regularly, with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to persuading people to trust him with important decisions. Mutual friend. I couldn't think of anyone who would give out my address to strangers, especially not financial salespeople. Most of our friends were dead, and the survivors were dealing with their own problems. Who would that be? Kevin's smile widened slightly, like he had been expecting this question. Mrs. Patterson at First Methodist mentioned you might benefit from some financial planning assistance. She was concerned about widows and widowers managing a loan. Helen Patterson ran the bereavement support group. Dorothy had insisted I attend twice before I had stopped going. She meant well, but her idea of support usually involved connecting people with services they didn't need but might pay for anyway. I am managing fine, I said, though we both knew this was at best a partial truth. My finances are simple. Pension, Social Security, no debt. Nothing that requires professional assistance. This was mostly accurate. Dorothy and I had lived conservatively, saved regularly, and avoided the financial complications that destroyed other couples our age. What I didn't mention was how thin those resources had become. How carefully I had to budget every expense. How often I lay awake, calculating whether my money would outlast my body. Kevin nodded sympathetically, like he had heard this response before, and had strategies for overcoming resistance. Of course, Mr. Chen, independence is important, especially at our age. But sometimes a second opinion can identify opportunities we might miss. Would you mind if I came in for just a few minutes? I promise not to pressure you into anything. Just a conversation between two people who understand the challenges of financial planning and retirement. I should have said no. Dorothy would have said no. She had had excellent instincts about people who wanted something from us. An ability to detect insincerity that I had never developed, but Kevin seemed genuine. And his mention of understanding challenges suggested he might actually comprehend the financial anxiety that kept me awake most nights. Besides, I hadn't had a real conversation with another human being in weeks. The loneliness made me vulnerable to anyone offering human contact, even strangers with briefcases. 10 minutes, I said, opening the door wider. Coffee's not fresh, but I can make more if you would like some. This was the kind of hospitality Dorothy had taught me. The assumption that visitors deserved courtesy regardless of their intentions. Kevin declined the coffee but accepted the invitation to sit in the living room, where he looked around with what seemed like genuine appreciation for the furniture Dorothy had chosen, the photographs of our life together, the careful organization that suggested people who had taken pride in their home. 47 years of marriage, he said, nodding toward our wedding photo on the mantel. That is becoming rare these days. You must miss her terribly. His voice carried just the right note of sympathy. Not overdone, but acknowledging the grief without demanding details. It was exactly what someone like me needed to hear. Validation that my loss mattered without requiring me to explain emotions I couldn't articulate even to myself. Every day, I admitted, surprised by my honesty with this stranger. She handled everything. Social calendar, bills, insurance, medical appointments. I built bridges for 43 years, but Dorothy built our life. Without her, I trailed off, unwilling to complete the thought that I was failing at basic survival without her guidance and support. Kevin leaned forward slightly, his expression combining professional concern with what appeared to be genuine empathy. That is exactly why Mrs. Patterson thought we should meet. Many couples divide responsibilities, and when one partner passes away, the survivor faces challenges they have never had to handle alone. There is no shame in needing assistance. In fact, recognizing when you need help is a sign of wisdom, not weakness. He was saying everything I needed to hear, validating feelings I had been too proud to admit even to myself. The financial anxiety, the social isolation, the sense that I was failing at tasks Dorothy had made look effortless. Kevin seemed to understand all of it without requiring painful explanations. For the first time in months, I felt like someone recognized the specific challenges of elderly widowerhood without judgment or condescension. What kind of assistance? I asked, though I suspected this conversation was leading toward services I couldn't afford. Financial planners charged fees that assumed clients had money to plan with, and my resources were too limited for professional management. Still, Kevin's approach felt different, more focused on understanding my situation than selling expensive solutions. Kevin opened his briefcase with practiced efficiency, withdrawing documents that looked official and comprehensive. I specialize in helping seniors protect their assets from common pitfalls, inflation, healthcare costs, tax implications, Estate planning issues. Many people your age discover they are more vulnerable than they realized, especially when they are managing everything alone for the first time. Vulnerable. The word stung because it was accurate. I had spent 73 years being competent, self-reliant, the person others came to for solutions. Now I felt vulnerable to everything: financial predators, health emergencies, loneliness so profound it affected my judgment. Kevin was the first person who had acknowledged this vulnerability without making me feel ashamed of it. For instance, Kevin continued, spreading papers across Dorothy's coffee table like he was preparing to solve my problems through paperwork. Are you confident your current arrangements would protect your assets if you needed long-term care, or if someone challenged your mental capacity? These are uncomfortable questions, but they are important ones. Mental capacity. The phrase hit me like a physical blow. Dorothy had maintained our social connections, remembered appointments, handled complex financial decisions that required patience and attention to detail. Without her, I'd been making mistakes, forgetting bills, missing appointments, struggling with tasks that had seemed simple when she had managed them. Was my competence deteriorating? Or was I just overwhelmed by responsibilities I had never had to handle alone? I haven't thought about that, I admitted, though the truth was I had been worrying about exactly those issues every night when sleep wouldn't come. My son lives in Seattle. We don't talk much. If something happened to me, I couldn't finish the sentence. Couldn't admit out loud that Michael might not even notice if I became incapacitated. Our relationship had been formal and distant even when Dorothy was alive to bridge our emotional gaps. Kevin nodded knowingly, like he had seen this situation countless times. Family dynamics can be complicated, especially when geography and time create distance. That is why it is important to have legal protections in place before they are needed. Powers of attorney, healthcare directives, financial safeguards that ensure your wishes are respected, even if family members aren't immediately available. Legal protections. This sounded expensive and complicated, requiring lawyers and documents and decisions I wasn't qualified to make alone. But Kevin was right about family dynamics. Michael lived his own life 3,000 miles away, checking in occasionally out of duty rather than genuine concern. If I needed help, if my judgment became compromised, who would protect my interests? Who would make sure I wasn't taken advantage of by people who preyed on confused elderly men? This sounds like something I should discuss with an attorney, I said, trying to maintain some semblance of caution even as Kevin's arguments made increasingly good sense. Dorothy would have insisted on getting multiple opinions, researching options, comparing costs before making any decisions. But Dorothy wasn't here to provide that careful analysis. And I was struggling to think clearly about complex issues that felt overwhelming when faced alone. Kevin's smile became more confident, like he would successfully moved past my initial resistance. Actually, that is one of the services we provide: legal coordination, document preparation, working with qualified attorneys who specialize in elder law. We handle everything, so you don't have to navigate these complicated systems alone. Most of our clients find it much less stressful than trying to coordinate multiple professionals independently. One-stop shopping for elderly protection. It sounded convenient, efficient, exactly what someone in my situation needed. Kevin was offering to solve problems I had been worried about for months, providing expertise I didn't possess, handling complexities that had been keeping me awake at night. The relief of having someone competent take charge of these issues was almost overwhelming. What would something like this cost? I asked, though I suspected the answer would be more than my limited budget could accommodate. Financial planning services were expensive, and comprehensive legal protection probably required fees that reflected the expertise Kevin was offering. But maybe there were payment plans. Maybe the security would be worth the expense. Maybe this was exactly what Dorothy would want me to do. Kevin's expression became reassuring, like he had anticipated this concern and had solutions ready. The initial consultation is complimentary. After that, we work with each client to develop arrangements they can afford. Many people are surprised by how reasonable these services can be, especially when you consider the peace of mind they provide. We are not trying to get rich off seniors' fears. We are trying to provide genuine protection for people who need it most. Reasonable costs, peace of mind, genuine protection. Everything Kevin said addressed my specific anxieties while offering solutions that seemed both professional and affordable. For the first time since Dorothy's death, I felt like someone was offering real help rather than empty sympathy or expensive services I couldn't afford. Kevin seemed to understand exactly what elderly widowers needed: competent assistance without condescension, protection without loss of dignity. What would be the next step? I heard myself asking, though part of me recognized this was probably a mistake. Dorothy would have asked more questions, demanded references, insisted on time to think before making any decisions. But Dorothy had possessed confidence and social skills that made her comfortable challenging authority. I had been deferring to experts my entire life, trusting people who seemed more knowledgeable than me about subjects I didn't understand. Kevin began gathering his papers with practiced efficiency, like he would successfully completed the most challenging part of his presentation. I would like to review your current financial situation, just to understand what we are working with. Bank statements, investment accounts, insurance policies, property values. Nothing invasive, just enough information to develop appropriate protection strategies. Financial information. This was the point where caution should have overwhelmed loneliness, where I should have politely declined and sought second opinions before sharing personal details with someone I had known for 30 minutes. But Kevin had spent that time validating my concerns, offering solutions to problems that had been consuming my thoughts for months. He had made me feel understood rather than judged, competent rather than vulnerable. I keep everything in Dorothy's filing system, I said, standing up to retrieve the documents that represented our life's financial accumulation. She was organized. Everything's labeled and current. This was true. Dorothy had maintained meticulous records, updating files regularly, organizing documents so thoroughly that finding anything was simple, even for someone who hadn't participated in the system's creation. As I gathered bank statements and insurance policies, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Kevin offered expertise I desperately needed, protection against vulnerabilities I couldn't address alone, solutions to problems that had been growing larger and more frightening every day. For the first time since Dorothy's death, I felt like someone competent was willing to help me navigate the complexities of survival without her guidance. I spread the documents across the coffee table, watching Kevin's expression as he reviewed numbers that represented 47 years of careful saving and conservative investment. Dorothy and I had lived modestly, saved regularly, built what we had thought was adequate security for our retirement years. The medical bills had depleted our savings, but we had still accumulated more than many couples our age. Kevin's face remained professionally neutral, but I thought I detected satisfaction in his eyes as he calculated our net worth. "This is very helpful, Mr. Chen. You and Dorothy did an excellent job building financial security with proper management. These assets should provide for your needs indefinitely." His voice carried approval that made me feel proud of decisions Dorothy and I had made together. We had sacrificed immediate pleasures for long-term security, chosen conservative investments over risky speculation, built wealth slowly and carefully over decades of shared effort. "The question," Kevin continued, "is how to protect these assets from the challenges that face elderly individuals living alone: healthcare costs, cognitive decline, financial predators who target seniors, family members who might challenge your mental capacity. These are real risks that require professional attention." Real risks. Kevin was naming fears that had been haunting me for months, giving them substance and urgency that demanded action. I had been worried about all of these possibilities without knowing how to address them, lying awake at night calculating worst-case scenarios and feeling helpless to prevent them. Kevin was offering protection against specific threats I had been too frightened to confront alone. "What kind of protection?" I asked. Though I was already committed to whatever Kevin recommended, he had demonstrated understanding of my situation, expertise in areas where I felt incompetent, and solutions to problems that had been overwhelming me for months. More importantly, he had treated me with respect rather than condescension, like someone whose concerns were valid rather than paranoid. Kevin reached into his briefcase again, withdrawing a folder that looked official and comprehensive. "Legal arrangements that ensure your wishes are respected even if your judgment becomes compromised. Powers of attorney for financial and medical decisions. trust structures that protect assets from healthcare costs and estate challenges, professional management that removes the burden of day-to-day financial decisions from your shoulders. Professional management. This sounded like exactly what I needed: competent people handling complex decisions I was struggling to make alone. Dorothy had managed our finances effortlessly, but I had been making mistakes, forgetting deadlines, struggling with tasks that required patience and attention to detail I no longer possessed. Professional management would restore the competence Dorothy had provided, ensuring our financial security wouldn't be compromised by my limitations. The paperwork looks complicated, I observed, though Kevin's explanations made the concepts seem reasonable and necessary. Dorothy would have read every document carefully, asked questions about terms I didn't understand, insisted on legal review before signing anything. But Dorothy had possessed confidence in challenging authority that I had never developed. I had spent my career implementing other people's designs, rather than questioning their expertise. Kevin's expression became reassuring, like he had anticipated this concern and had strategies for addressing it. The documents are comprehensive because they need to cover multiple scenarios, but the concepts are straightforward. You are appointing qualified people to protect your interests if you become unable to do so yourself. Think of it as insurance against the vulnerabilities that face elderly individuals living alone. Insurance against vulnerability. This made perfect sense to someone who had spent months feeling helpless against forces beyond my control. Kevin was offering protection against specific threats that kept me awake at night. Professional expertise in areas where I felt incompetent, security against risks I couldn't address alone. The documents might be complicated, but the goal was simple: ensuring I wouldn't become a victim of my own limitations or other people's predatory behavior. How quickly would these arrangements need to be finalized? I asked, though part of me recognized this was probably Kevin's sales technique, creating urgency that prevented careful consideration. But his arguments made sense. His solutions addressed real problems, and my isolation made me desperate for competent assistance. The loneliness had eroded my judgment, making me vulnerable to anyone offering help, even strangers with briefcases. Kevin glanced at his watch, then looked at me with what appeared to be genuine concern. These arrangements work best when implemented before they are needed. Once someone's mental capacity becomes questionable, the legal hurdles become much more complicated. I would recommend moving forward within the next week or two, while your decision-making authority is clearly established. Mental capacity. The phrase terrified me because I had been questioning my own competence for months. Was I thinking clearly about these decisions, or was grief and loneliness affecting my judgment? Kevin seemed confident in my mental abilities, treating me like someone capable of making important decisions, rather than a confused elderly man who needed protection from his own limitations. His respect for my decision-making capacity was another reason to trust his expertise. A week or two, I repeated, feeling pressure to make decisions I wasn't qualified to evaluate independently. But Kevin had spent an hour demonstrating understanding of my situation, offering solutions to problems I couldn't solve alone, treating me with respect rather than condescension. His timeline might be aggressive, but his arguments were compelling, and my alternatives were limited. Who else was offering to help? Who else understood the specific challenges facing elderly widowers? Kevin began organizing the documents on Dorothy's coffee table, like we had reached agreement on moving forward, even though I hadn't explicitly committed to anything. I will prepare the paperwork and coordinate with our legal team. We can finalize everything at your convenience, probably here in your home where you are most comfortable. The process is designed to be as simple as possible for clients. Simple, convenient, professional. Everything Kevin offered addressed my specific needs, while removing burdens I was struggling to carry alone. For the first time since Dorothy's death, someone competent was offering to help me navigate complexities that had been overwhelming me for months. The relief was so profound I almost didn't notice how quickly Kevin had moved from consultation to implementation. I appreciate your time, Mr. Chen, Kevin said, standing up and gathering his materials with practiced efficiency. I will contact you early next week to schedule the signing appointment. In the meantime, don't worry about these financial matters. We will have everything protected soon. His confidence was reassuring, like he would successfully handled hundreds of similar cases, and knew exactly how to solve problems. that seemed impossible to me. As Kevin left, I sat in the living room surrounded by Dorothy's furniture and lifetime of shared memories, feeling something I hadn't experienced in months: hope. Someone competent was going to help me protect what Dorothy and I had built together. Someone professional was going to handle complexities I couldn't manage alone. Someone knowledgeable was going to ensure I wouldn't become a victim of my own limitations or other people's predatory behavior. The house felt less empty with the promise of Kevin's assistance. I had spent months drowning in responsibilities Dorothy had handled effortlessly, struggling with decisions that required expertise I didn't possess, worrying about vulnerabilities I couldn't address alone. Kevin offered solutions to all of these problems: professional competence in areas where I felt helpless, protection against threats that had been consuming my thoughts for months. That evening, I called Michael in Seattle, something I hadn't done in over a month. "Son, I wanted to let you know I am working with a financial planner to get some things organized." I didn't mention Kevin's name or specific arrangements, partly because I wasn't sure Michael would approve, and partly because I wanted to maintain some independence in my decision-making. "That is probably smart, Dad." Michael's voice carried surprise that I was taking initiative about anything beyond basic survival. "Mom always handled that stuff. Do you need me to fly out and help with anything?" His offer sounded dutiful rather than enthusiastic, like he was hoping I had declined so he wouldn't have to disrupt his busy life for his grieving father's financial planning. "No, I am managing fine," I said, though we both knew this was optimistic at best. "Just wanted you to know I am not completely helpless without your mother." This came out more defensively than I had intended, revealing how much I resented Michael's assumption that I couldn't handle basic life management without Dorothy's constant supervision. "Of course not, Dad. I just meant, well, you know what I meant." Michael's discomfort with emotional conversations had been obvious since childhood, and Dorothy's death had made our interactions even more stilted and careful. We were two men who had never learned how to express feelings without a woman translating for us, struggling to maintain connection across geographic and emotional distance that seemed unbridgeable. After Michael hung up, I sat in my recliner thinking about Kevin's visit and the hope it had generated. Someone competent was going to help me protect Dorothy's legacy. Someone professional was going to handle complexities I couldn't manage alone. Someone knowledgeable was going to ensure our 47 years of careful planning wouldn't be destroyed by my limitations as a single elderly man. The weekend passed with unusual optimism. I actually looked forward to Monday morning, when Kevin would call to schedule our signing appointment. For the first time since Dorothy's death, I felt like someone was offering genuine assistance rather than empty sympathy or expensive services I couldn't afford. Kevin understood exactly what elderly widowers needed: competent help without condescension, protection without loss of dignity, solutions to problems that seemed overwhelming when faced alone. Monday morning brought Kevin's call at exactly 9 of the clock, professional punctuality that reinforced my confidence in his competence. "Mr. Chen, I have the documents prepared. Would Wednesday afternoon work for the signing appointment? I can bring a notary to make everything official." His voice carried the same reassuring confidence I remembered from our initial meeting, like he had handled hundreds of similar cases and knew exactly how to protect elderly clients from financial vulnerability. "Wednesday afternoon sounds fine," I said, feeling grateful that someone competent was taking charge of complexities I couldn't handle alone. "Should I prepare anything special, or review the documents before you arrive?" This seemed like the kind of careful preparation Dorothy would have insisted on, though I wasn't sure I would understand legal language well enough to evaluate what I was signing. Kevin's chuckle was warm and reassuring, like he had anticipated this question and had experience helping confused elderly clients navigate complicated paperwork. "Everything will be explained clearly when I arrive. The documents are straightforward, and I will walk you through each section so you understand exactly what you are signing. We want you to feel completely comfortable with these arrangements." Completely comfortable. This was exactly what I needed to hear: assurance that Kevin would guide me through complexities I couldn't evaluate independently. Dorothy had always handled legal documents, reading carefully, asking questions, ensuring we understood implications before making commitments. Kevin was offering to provide that same careful analysis, protecting me from making mistakes that could compromise our financial security. Wednesday arrived with a familiar mixture of anxiety and hope that had characterized most of my interactions with helpful strangers since Dorothy's death. I dressed carefully, choosing clothes Dorothy had bought me, wanting to make a good impression on Kevin and the notary who would witness my signature on documents designed to protect our life's accumulation. The house was clean, coffee was fresh, and I felt more optimistic than I had in months about my ability to navigate widowerhood without destroying everything Dorothy and I had built together. Kevin arrived precisely at 2 o'clock, accompanied by a middle-aged woman carrying an official-looking bag and wearing the kind of serious expression notaries probably cultivated to inspire confidence in their professional competence. Mr. Chen, this is Janet Miller, our certified notary. She will witness your signatures and ensure everything is properly documented. Janet's handshake was firm, her smile professional, her presence adding official weight to proceedings that felt increasingly important and legitimate. I appreciate you both coming here, I said, leading them into the living room where Dorothy's careful organization created an atmosphere of respectability and competence. This is much more convenient than trying to coordinate appointments at multiple offices. This was true. Kevin's willingness to handle everything at my home demonstrated consideration for elderly clients who might struggle with transportation or unfamiliar environments. Kevin spread documents across Dorothy's coffee table with practiced efficiency, creating an impressive display of legal papers that looked comprehensive and official. These arrangements will protect your assets from the most common threats facing elderly individuals: healthcare costs, cognitive decline, financial predators, family challenges to your mental capacity. Everything we discussed last week, properly documented and legally enforceable. Legal protection against real threats. Kevin was implementing solutions to problems that had been keeping me awake at night, providing professional expertise in areas where I felt helpless, ensuring our financial security wouldn't be compromised by my limitations as a single elderly man. The documents looked complicated, but Kevin's explanations made the concepts seem reasonable and necessary. This first document, Kevin explained, pointing to a multi-page form with my name prominently displayed, establishes power of attorney for financial decisions. If you become unable to manage your affairs independently, qualified professionals will ensure your assets are protected and managed according to your wishes. He spoke slowly and clearly, like he understood that elderly clients needed time to process complex information. Power of attorney. This sounded like exactly what I needed: competent people making financial decisions if my judgment became compromised. Dorothy had handled complex financial management effortlessly, but I had been struggling with tasks that required patience and attention to detail I no longer possessed. Professional management would restore the competence Dorothy had provided, protecting our assets from my limitations. Who would have this authority? I asked, though I assumed Kevin's organization employed qualified professionals, specifically trained to protect elderly clients' interests. This seemed safer than relying on family members who lived far away and had their own priorities, or struggling alone with decisions I wasn't qualified to make independently. Kevin's expression became reassuring, like he had anticipated this question and had satisfactory answers ready. Our firm specializes in fiduciary services for senior clients. We have certified financial planners, experienced attorneys, and administrative staff, specifically trained in elder care issues. Your assets would be managed by people who understand the unique needs of clients in your situation. Certified professionals with specialized training. This sounded much more reliable than my own confused attempts at financial management, or Michael's distant and dutiful supervision from 3,000 miles away. Kevin's firm offered expertise I desperately needed, professional competence in areas where I felt helpless, specialized knowledge about challenges facing elderly widowers living alone. The second document, Kevin continued, indicating another multi-page form, addresses healthcare decisions. If you become unable to communicate your medical preferences, appointed advocates will ensure your wishes are respected and your care is managed appropriately. This also seemed reasonable and necessary. Dorothy had made medical decisions for both of us during her final years, and I had never developed comfort with healthcare complexity. And this document, Kevin said, pointing to the most impressive-looking form, establishes trust arrangements that protect your assets from nursing home costs, estate taxes, and other expenses that can devastate elderly individuals' financial security. Your money will be professionally managed and protected, regardless of what health challenges you might face in the future. Trust arrangements, professional management, protection from devastating expenses. Everything Kevin described addressed fears that had been consuming my thoughts since Dorothy's death. Medical costs had destroyed our savings during her final years, and I had been terrified of facing similar expenses without her advocacy and support. Kevin was offering protection against financial catastrophe that could leave me destitute and dependent on public assistance. This seems very comprehensive, I observed, though the documents looked too complicated for me to evaluate independently. Dorothy would have read every page carefully, asked questions about terms she didn't understand, possibly consulted with other professionals before signing anything. But Dorothy had possessed confidence and expertise I had never developed, and Kevin was offering to provide the careful analysis I couldn't perform alone. Janet the notary leaned forward, her expression professionally serious. "Mr. Chen, do you understand what you are signing? Are you entering into these arrangements voluntarily, without coercion or undue influence?" Her questions sounded like legal requirements rather than genuine concern about my comprehension, but they reinforced the official nature of proceedings that felt increasingly important and legitimate. "I understand the general concepts," I said, though this was probably optimistic. "Kevin has explained how these documents will protect my assets and ensure my wishes are respected if I become unable to make decisions independently. That is exactly what I need." This seemed like the appropriate response, acknowledging Kevin's expertise while expressing confidence in arrangements designed to solve problems I couldn't address alone. Kevin handed me a pen, pointing to signature lines on each document. "Just sign here, here, and here. Janet will witness and notarize everything, making these arrangements legally binding and immediately effective." His voice carried confidence that these signatures would solve problems that had been overwhelming me for months, protecting Dorothy's legacy and ensuring I wouldn't become a victim of my own limitations. I signed the first document, watching my signature commit our life's accumulation to professional management by people I had known for a week. But Kevin had demonstrated understanding of my situation, expertise in areas where I felt helpless, solutions to problems that seemed impossible when faced alone. His confidence was reassuring, like he would successfully protected hundreds of similar clients from financial vulnerability. The second signature felt easier, like I was gaining momentum toward solving problems that had been consuming my thoughts for months. Kevin's explanations made sense. His solutions addressed real threats, and his professional competence offered hope that I could navigate widowerhood without destroying everything Dorothy and I had built together. The relief was so profound I barely noticed how quickly we were moving through documents I didn't fully understand. The third signature completed arrangements that would protect our assets from healthcare costs, cognitive decline, and other threats facing elderly individuals living alone. Kevin gathered the documents with satisfaction, like we would successfully implemented comprehensive protection against vulnerabilities I had been too frightened to confront independently. Janet notarized everything with official stamps and signatures that made our agreements legally binding and immediately effective. "Congratulations, Mr. Chen," Kevin said, shaking my hand with warmth that suggested genuine pleasure in helping elderly clients protect their financial security. "Your assets are now professionally managed and legally protected. You can stop worrying about financial complexity and focus on enjoying your retirement years." His smile carried satisfaction that we had solved problems I had been struggling with for months. After Kevin and Janet left, I sat in the living room feeling something I hadn't experienced since Dorothy's death: complete relief. Someone competent was now managing financial complexities I couldn't handle alone. Someone professional was protecting our assets from threats I had been too frightened to address independently. Someone knowledgeable was ensuring our 47 years of careful planning wouldn't be destroyed by my limitations as a single elderly man. The house felt different with the knowledge that experts were now responsible for protecting Dorothy's legacy. I had spent months drowning in responsibilities she had handled effortlessly, struggling with decisions that required expertise I didn't possess, worrying about vulnerabilities I couldn't address alone. Kevin's arrangements had solved all of these problems, providing professional competence in areas where I felt helpless, specialized protection against specific threats that had been consuming my thoughts. That evening, I tried calling Michael to share news about the financial arrangements, but got his voicemail and decided not to leave a message about something so complex and personal. Besides, These were my decisions to make. Evidence that I could handle important life management without constant supervision or approval from family members who lived their own busy lives far away. Kevin had treated me like someone capable of making intelligent choices rather than a confused elderly man who needed protection from his own limitations. The following weeks passed with unusual tranquility. I no longer worried about financial management. Knowing that qualified professionals were handling complexities I couldn't navigate independently. The bank statement stopped coming to my house, which Kevin had explained was normal when professional management took over. Everything would be handled efficiently, without burdening me with paperwork I wouldn't understand anyway. For the first time since Dorothy's death, I felt protected rather than vulnerable. But gradually, small details began creating uneasiness that I initially dismissed as paranoid anxiety. The automatic bill payments Dorothy had established seemed to have stopped working. Utilities, property taxes, insurance premiums that had always been handled electronically were generating disconnect notices and late fees. When I called Kevin's office to ask about this, his assistant explained that transitioning accounts to professional management sometimes created temporary disruptions that would be resolved quickly. The grocery store clerk mentioned that my debit card had been declined twice, something that had never happened when Dorothy managed our banking. Kevin's assistant assured me this was a temporary authorization problem, while accounts were being restructured for professional management, and provided a phone number for emergency access to funds. But the emergency number required multiple transfers and extensive identity verification before releasing small amounts of money for basic expenses. My doctor's office called to say my health insurance premium was overdue, threatening cancellation of coverage I had maintained continuously for 15 years. Kevin's assistant explained that medical insurance was being upgraded to more comprehensive coverage that better protected elderly clients. But the transition required temporary gaps in protection. This seemed potentially dangerous. Going without health insurance at 73 could be financially catastrophic if medical emergencies occurred. Most disturbing, I received a letter from the county tax assessor indicating my property taxes were significantly overdue, with penalties and interest accumulating daily. When I called Kevin's office, his assistant seemed surprised that I was still receiving mail at my home address, explaining that all correspondence should have been forwarded to their office for professional handling. She promised to resolve the tax issue immediately, but suggested I might be more comfortable in assisted living arrangements where such complexities wouldn't burden me. Assisted living, the phrase struck me like a physical blow. Kevin had never mentioned relocating me from the home Dorothy and I had shared for 32 years. The house where all our memories lived, the only environment where I felt connected to our life together. Assisted living sounded like the beginning of losing independence entirely, surrendering control of my environment, along with my financial decision-making. I began noticing other changes that created growing uneasiness about arrangements I had thought would simplify my life. The mailbox that had always contained bills, statements, and correspondence now brought only advertisements and solicitations. My pension checks were no longer deposited to accounts I could access. Kevin's assistant explained that direct professional management was more efficient, eliminating the need for me to monitor financial transactions I wouldn't understand anyway. The telephone began ringing frequently with calls from Kevin's office, asking about my daily activities, my health status, my satisfaction with professional services. The questions seemed designed to monitor my mental competence rather than ensure my comfort, creating the impression that I was being evaluated for continued independent living rather than simply receiving financial assistance. When I expressed concern about these monitoring calls, Kevin's assistant suggested that regular contact was standard procedure for elderly clients who might need additional support services. She mentioned that many clients eventually required more comprehensive assistance with daily activities, medication management, and social interaction. The conversation felt less like customer service and more like preparation for something I hadn't agreed to. The final shock came when I tried to visit my longtime bank to withdraw cash for weekly expenses. The teller, someone who had known Dorothy and me for over a decade, explained apologetically that my accounts had been closed and transferred to institutions I had never heard of. She couldn't provide specific information about where my money had gone, suggesting I contact the financial services company that had initiated the transfers. Closed accounts, transferred funds, institutions I had never authorized. Everything Dorothy and I had accumulated over 47 years of marriage had disappeared into a system I couldn't access or understand. Kevin's arrangements hadn't protected our assets, they had made them disappear entirely. I had signed documents I had thought would safeguard our financial security, but instead I would somehow given away control of everything we had worked our entire lives to build. That night, I sat in Dorothy's recliner trying to understand what had happened to our life's accumulation. The documents I had signed were locked in Kevin's office, the accounts I had trusted were closed, and the professional management I would paid for had made me financially powerless. Instead of protecting me from vulnerability, Kevin's arrangements had made me completely dependent on people I barely knew for access to my own money. The loneliness and confusion that had made me vulnerable to Kevin's approach now seemed like minor problems compared to the complete loss of financial independence I would somehow agreed to. I had trusted someone who had seemed competent and caring, signed documents I had thought would solve my problems, and discovered too late that I had made the most expensive mistake of my life. But as I sat in the darkness of our home, surrounded by 47 years of shared memories, I realized something that Kevin probably hadn't anticipated when he had targeted what he had assumed was a confused and isolated elderly man. Dorothy hadn't just taught me to trust people who seemed helpful. She would also taught me to fight back when people betrayed that trust, and I had spent 60 years building bridges that required precise engineering, careful calculation, and absolute determination to overcome obstacles that seemed impossible. Kevin Morrison had made a serious mistake. He had assumed I was just another helpless widower who would surrender without resistance. He was about to discover that some elderly men don't just get angry when they are cheated. They get methodical. And methodical anger, backed by 60 years of engineering experience and 47 years of marriage to a woman who had taught me never to quit fighting for what was right, could be extremely dangerous to people who preyed on what they assumed were easy targets. The war was about to begin, and Kevin Morrison had no idea what kind of enemy he would accidentally created. I spent the next 3 days methodically documenting every interaction with Kevin Morrison and his associates, applying the same systematic approach I had used to design bridges that needed to withstand forces that could destroy them. Dorothy had taught me to keep careful records, and my engineering background had made me naturally suspicious of anything that couldn't be verified through documentation. Now those habits were going to save me from the most expensive mistake of my life. The basement filing cabinets contained 47 years of financial records that Dorothy had maintained with obsessive precision. Bank statements, investment reports, tax returns, insurance policies, every document that proved what Kevin Morrison and his associates had stolen. I had signed papers I had thought would protect these assets, but Dorothy's files would prove exactly what had been taken and how the theft had been accomplished. More importantly, those basement files contained something Kevin Morrison had never asked about, and I had never mentioned. Dorothy's will, executed 6 months before her death, had included provisions that neither Kevin nor I had discussed. She had been more suspicious of financial predators than I had realized, and her attorney had helped her create protections that wouldn't activate until someone tried to steal what we had built together. Dorothy had established a trust that couldn't be accessed or transferred without verification from 2 independent attorneys and a certified financial auditor. Everything Kevin thought he had stolen was actually protected by legal arrangements that made his documents worthless. My wife had been more clever than either Kevin or I had realized, anticipating exactly the kind of predatory behavior Kevin specialized in. But the most important discovery in those basement files was a business card Dorothy had hidden in her personal papers, wrapped in a note written in her familiar handwriting. Robert, if someone tries to steal our money after I am gone, call this number immediately. Margaret Chen specializes in destroying financial predators who target elderly people. She has been waiting for your call, Margaret Chen. No relation, but someone Dorothy had researched and contacted before her death. Someone who specialized in exactly the situation I now faced. Dorothy had anticipated that predators might target me after her death, and had arranged for professional help I had never known existed. My wife had protected me even after she was gone, leaving weapons I could use to fight back against people who assumed elderly widowers were helpless victims. I called Margaret Chen's office immediately, explaining that Dorothy Hartley had referred me before her death. Within 2 hours, I was sitting in Margaret's downtown office, surrounded by law books and case files that suggested someone who had spent years destroying financial predators who targeted vulnerable elderly people. Mr. Chen, Margaret said, reviewing the documents Kevin had pressured me to sign. Your wife contacted me 8 months ago, concerned that you might be targeted after her death. She described exactly the approach this Kevin Morrison used: family connections, urgent timelines, comprehensive protection that actually strips elderly people of all financial control. Dorothy had known. She had anticipated Kevin's approach with precision that suggested she had researched financial predators extensively, understanding their methods well enough to prepare countermeasures I had never imagined. My wife had been fighting this war before it started, leaving me weapons I had only just discovered. The documents you signed are completely fraudulent, Margaret continued, spreading Kevin's papers across her desk like evidence in a criminal trial. Power of attorney arrangements that require multiple independent verifications, trust transfers that cannot be executed without court approval, financial management agreements that violate federal regulations protecting elderly consumers. Everything Kevin Morrison did was illegal. Illegal. Kevin Morrison hadn't just stolen our money, he had committed federal crimes that carried significant prison sentences. Margaret was explaining that his entire operation was a criminal enterprise that targeted elderly people with systematic fraud, identity theft, and financial manipulation that violated numerous federal statutes designed to protect vulnerable consumers. More importantly, Margaret said, pulling out files that looked like military intelligence reports, Kevin Morrison is part of a network that has been targeting elderly people across 3 states. We have been tracking his operation for 2 years, gathering evidence for federal prosecution. Your case provides the final documentation we need to destroy his entire criminal organization. Criminal organization. Kevin Morrison wasn't just a dishonest financial planner. He was part of a systematic operation that destroyed elderly people's lives for profit. Margaret had been hunting him for years, collecting evidence that would send him and his associates to federal prison for decades. Dorothy's preparations had connected me with someone who had been fighting this war long before Kevin had targeted me. What happens next? I asked, feeling something I hadn't experienced since Kevin's first visit: hope that competent people were going to solve problems I couldn't handle alone. But this time, the competent people were hunting predators, instead of being predators themselves. Margaret smiled with an expression that reminded me of Dorothy when she was planning to outwit someone who had underestimated her intelligence. Next, we destroy Kevin Morrison so thoroughly that he will spend the rest of his life warning other predators about the dangers of targeting elderly people. Federal prosecution, asset forfeiture, criminal charges that will put him in prison until he is elderly himself. Federal prosecution, asset forfeiture, prison sentences that would ensure Kevin Morrison never targeted another elderly person. Margaret was describing justice that matched the crime, consequences that would protect other vulnerable people from experiencing what Kevin had done to me. Dorothy's preparations hadn't just protected our money, they had connected me with someone who could prevent other elderly people from becoming victims. The first step, Margaret explained, is documenting the full extent of Kevin's fraud, while pretending you don't realize what he has done. We need him to continue his operation while we gather evidence that will ensure his conviction. Can you do that? Can you pretend to be the confused elderly man he thinks you are? Pretend to be confused. After 43 years of engineering work that required precise calculation and systematic problem solving, pretending to be helpless would require acting skills I had never developed. But Dorothy had always said I was more capable than I gave myself credit for. And this situation demanded capabilities I had never had to use. I can do that, I said, thinking about Kevin's assumption that elderly widowers were easy targets who wouldn't fight back. How long will this take? Margaret's expression became predatory, like someone who had spent years planning revenge against people who destroyed elderly people's lives. 6 weeks, maybe 8, long enough to document everything Kevin Morrison has stolen from you and dozens of other victims. Long enough to build a federal case that will keep him in prison for the rest of his natural life. The rest of his natural life. Kevin Morrison would pay for every elderly person he had victimized, every family he had destroyed, every life savings he had stolen through systematic fraud that targeted society's most vulnerable members. Margaret was offering justice that would protect future victims while punishing past crimes. The investigation began immediately. Margaret's team installed recording equipment in my home, monitored Kevin's communications, tracked financial transactions that revealed the scope of his criminal operation. Within 2 weeks, they had documented theft from 37 elderly victims across 3 states, totaling over $4 million that Kevin and his associates had stolen through fraudulent financial services. Kevin continued calling regularly, checking on my adjustment to professional financial management, and suggesting I might be more comfortable in assisted living arrangements where complex decisions wouldn't burden me. Each conversation was recorded, each suggestion documented, each manipulation preserved as evidence that would ensure his conviction. The assisted living pressure intensified when Kevin realized I wasn't receiving mail at home anymore. His operation apparently included intercepting elderly people's correspondence to prevent them from discovering unauthorized account changes. When I mentioned this to Kevin, he suggested that isolation from confusing financial information was beneficial for elderly clients who might become anxious about details they couldn't understand. Isolation from information, assisted living arrangements, complete dependence on professional management. Kevin's operation wasn't just stealing money, it was systematically destroying elderly people's independence, forcing them into institutional care where their remaining assets could be more efficiently transferred to criminal bank accounts. Margaret's investigation revealed that Kevin specialized in targeting recently widowed men who had significant assets, but limited social connections. The breakthrough came when Margaret's team intercepted communications between Kevin and his associates discussing their timeline for moving me to assisted living. They had planned everything in advance, the financial manipulation that would make me dependent on professional assistance, the isolation that would prevent me from seeking help, the institutional placement that would complete their control over my assets and medical decisions. Mr. Chen, Margaret said during one of our weekly meetings, Kevin Morrison has made the most expensive mistake of his criminal career. He targeted someone whose wife had prepared for exactly this situation, someone connected to law enforcement resources he never suspected, someone who is going to help us destroy his entire operation. Destroy his entire operation. Margaret was describing justice that extended far beyond my individual case, protection for future victims who would never experience what Kevin Morrison had done to me, and dozens of other elderly people. Dorothy's preparations hadn't just saved our money, they had connected me with people who could prevent systematic victimization of society's most vulnerable members. The arrest came on a Thursday morning 6 weeks after Margaret's investigation began. Federal agents surrounded Kevin's office while he was meeting with another elderly victim, documenting his fraudulent sales techniques in real time. The woman he was pressuring to sign away her financial independence was actually an undercover federal agent who had been recording everything for 3 hours. I watched the perp walk on television that evening, seeing Kevin Morrison in handcuffs and federal custody, finally experiencing consequences for years of systematic fraud that had destroyed dozens of elderly people's lives. The news reported that he was charged with 37 counts of elder fraud, money laundering, identity theft, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes against vulnerable adults. 37 counts. Kevin Morrison was facing federal charges that carried potential sentences totaling over 200 years in prison. Margaret had built a case so comprehensive that Kevin's attorneys immediately began discussing plea arrangements that might reduce his sentence to merely decades instead of centuries. The sentencing hearing is scheduled for next month, Margaret informed me during our final meeting. You will have the opportunity to provide victim impact testimony about how Kevin's fraud affected your life. Federal judges take elder fraud very seriously, especially when defendants have destroyed multiple victims' financial security. Victim impact testimony. The opportunity to explain how Kevin Morrison's predatory behavior had affected someone he had assumed was a helpless target. How his systematic fraud had nearly destroyed 47 years of careful financial planning. How his criminal operation had targeted society's most vulnerable members for personal profit at their expense. But more importantly, I would have the opportunity to explain how Dorothy's preparations had protected us from Kevin's fraud. How her anticipation of predatory behavior had connected me with resources that ensured justice. How her love had extended beyond death to fight battles I had never known were coming. The hearing took place in federal court downtown, in a courtroom that felt like a cathedral of justice where society's most serious criminals faced consequences for their crimes. Kevin Morrison sat at the defendant's table looking smaller and more frightened than I remembered, finally understanding that his victims weren't as helpless as he had assumed. Your Honor, I said when called to provide testimony, Kevin Morrison targeted me because he thought I was a confused elderly man who would surrender my independence without resistance. He was wrong about my confusion, but he was right about my age. I am 73 years old, and I have spent the last 6 decades learning that some problems require engineering solutions. The courtroom was silent, except for the court reporters typing as I explained how Dorothy's preparations had anticipated Kevin's approach, how Margaret's investigation had documented his systematic fraud, how federal prosecution would protect future victims from experiencing what Kevin had done to dozens of elderly people. Mr. Morrison, I concluded, looking directly at the man who had tried to steal our life's accumulation, made 2 critical miscalculations. First, he assumed elderly people are helpless victims who will not fight back. Second, he never asked whether the widow he was targeting had been married to an engineer who had spent 47 years learning how to solve problems that seem impossible. The judge sentenced Kevin Morrison to 35 years in federal prison, without possibility of parole. He would be 75 years old when released, assuming he survived long enough to experience freedom again. His associates received sentences ranging from 15 to 25 years, ensuring that their criminal organization would never target another elderly person. But the most satisfying moment came when the federal asset forfeiture program returned every penny Kevin had stolen from his victims, plus damages and interest that compensated them for the trauma his fraud had caused. The money he had thought he had stolen was distributed to elderly people who had had their independence restored, their dignity returned, their faith in justice confirmed. That evening, I sat in Dorothy's recliner reading the newspaper coverage of Kevin Morrison's conviction and sentencing. The headlines described him as the leader of a criminal organization that had systematically targeted elderly Americans, stealing over $4 million through fraudulent financial services that destroyed vulnerable people's independence and security. But the article that made me proudest was buried on page 6, describing how one victim's wife had prepared legal protections that exposed the entire criminal operation. Dorothy Chen, the story explained, had anticipated that her husband might be targeted after her death and had arranged for law enforcement resources that ensured justice for dozens of victims. Dorothy had won a war she had never lived to see, protecting not just our financial security, but dozens of other elderly people who would never know her name. Her preparations had turned me from a victim into a weapon against predators who assumed elderly people were helpless targets who wouldn't fight back. I called Michael that night to tell him about Kevin Morrison's conviction and the recovery of our assets. "Dad," he said, his voice carrying amazement I had never heard before, "I had no idea you were capable of fighting back like that. I mean, I knew you were smart, but this was like something from a movie. Your mother was the one who fought back." I corrected him. "She anticipated this before it happened, and left me weapons I didn't know I had. I just used the tools she had prepared." This was accurate. Dorothy's intelligence and preparation had made victory possible, while my engineering background had helped me implement her plan effectively. "Still," Michael said, "it takes courage to go up against criminals when you are alone. Most people would have just accepted the loss and tried to rebuild. You chose to fight instead of surrender." His voice carried respect I had never heard before, like he was seeing me as someone capable of independent action, rather than a grieving widower who needed constant supervision. After Michael hung up, I realized something that filled me with satisfaction deeper than Kevin Morrison's conviction, or the recovery of our stolen assets. For the first time since Dorothy's death, I felt like someone she would be proud of, not because I had solved problems she couldn't have handled, but because I had used capabilities she had always insisted I possessed. Dorothy had married an engineer who built bridges designed to withstand forces that could destroy them. Kevin Morrison had discovered too late that some bridges fight back when people try to tear them down, especially when those bridges were designed by someone who had spent 60 years learning how to solve problems that seemed impossible. The war was over. Justice had prevailed, and somewhere in whatever realm Dorothy now inhabited, I imagined her smiling with satisfaction that her stubborn old fool had finally learned to fight back against people who preyed on what they assumed were easy targets. Kevin Morrison was beginning a 35-year lesson in the dangers of underestimating elderly people whose spouses had taught them never to surrender without a fight. Some lessons are expensive enough to last a lifetime, especially when that lifetime is spent in federal prison regretting the decision to target the wrong widower.